One of those boomers who elevated freak into a compliment and turned party into a verb.
I was more worried about the mindless stunt he pulled in Norton's office because it meant Lenny's manic cycle could be kicking in.
The one on Mother's chest, noun that taught me scar, raised stripe where a breast had been.
This pitcher was the strikeout king of the league. People weren't supposed to hit home runs off of him, let alone me. I was not necessarily a long ball hitter.
I am Karen Shoemaker, and I was born and raised in Nebraska. I am a teacher and a writer and a stay-at-home mom, so it's sort of a combination on the tax forms. Writer, mom kind of answer there. But I teach at UNO part-time, and I work with the Nebraska Humanities Council, do workshops, writers' workshops, and sort of an itinerant teacher. I grew up in O'Neill, Nebraska, and went to St. Mary's, went to a Catholic school. So my 1 through 12 was a small-town Catholic school. I got my degrees at UNL. My bachelor's degree is in journalism, and then creative writing for master's and PhD. Well, it's a pretty strong influence because this is where I grew up. This is what I see when I close my eyes as well as when I open them. So the stories that I write, I picture the north central Nebraska, small town, not always the same small town, but I picture the people I know and knew, and I'm just very familiar with that, and so I keep revisiting those familiar places. That's not to say that I write about, that the stories are autobiographical. They're just a prototype, I guess you'd say. I think I would have to always say my mother was one of my biggest influences, because her and her sisters, my aunts, are storytellers. And so I grew up listening to people tell stories, and they weren't big, grand stories. We heard about prairie fires and tornadoes and the like, but we also just what it was like to get through a regular day, and that rhythm of listening to people talk is very much a part of who I am, and I tell stories constantly to my kids as well. Well, I think I realized I was a writer long before I recognized the oral storytelling, because that was just, I didn't give it any significance or any value before I figured out how it fit in my writing. And I've always liked books. I started out as a major reader, and I was always making up stories in my head. And really, this is going to sound strange, but one of the most beautiful things in the world is a blank page. And I recognized that a long time ago. There's something about getting a new notebook that was exciting even as a child. But I didn't start writing really until my 20s, when I went to college. And then I took up writing because it's something I could do. And I liked the classes, and so I ended up in journalism and liked it more and more and more, and then took up fiction writing in my 30s, sort of returned to a childhood love and actually started acting on it. Oh, that was a tough question. I was going to say, don't ask me that question. There's a lot of different things. I think I write because I have to write. I mean, whenever my life gets to the point where I can't write because other things are in the way, other jobs are in the way, life just isn't as much fun. I start to get very tense. I'm not a very pleasant person to be around unless I can get to the page. And it can be something as simple as journal writing. I write in a journal regularly, or writing letters. Although email has sort of taken away from the handwriting, I still write letters by hand on a regular basis, and there's just this drive to keep putting words down on the page. Yes, I think I do. I have a wide range, but because of the story that I'm going to read tonight, I'm thinking about one of them, which Edna St. Vincent Millay has a poem, childhood is not from birth to a certain age, but childhood is the kingdom where nobody dies. And that departure, that's a really butchering of her phrase, a beautiful poem. But that return to, I keep returning to that when a child leaves that kingdom. It's so rich because it's so unique to each of us. We all have our own story when we were out of that, when we left that kingdom. We all have individual ways in which it affected us, but it's also very universal. So I keep returning to it, not really intentionally. So often it's my characters, they just keep going there. So I keep going back to that theme, and that's the story I'm going to read tonight has, that's one of the sort of the parent inspirations for that story. Well, I would like to be able to just sit down when I felt like it, but I have to grab when I can. So I get up in the morning before I get the kids up and spend some time with the page. And then after the kids go off, I have a couple of places in my house. There's where I write. I have a desk that sits in front of the window, or I sit on the sofa and or sometimes I go to various coffee shops. If I have to get away from some job that's interfering with my writing, I have to leave the house. And so I do often go to coffee shops just to help me focus on just the page instead of some other job that needs doing. I'm not quite sure if I know how to characterize that. I think it's somewhat of an intimate voice. People often think I'm writing a story of my life, so it's very personal, but it's not true to facts. So I guess I have something. It goes back to those personal stories that I listened to as I was growing up. They're the things you hear, and I think that reflects in my writing. Not really truly specific, but I always hope I'm writing to somebody who loves to read. You know, a sort of open audience. I'm not an adversarial person, so I tend to just think of those adversarial people out there as not anything I worry about. I'm only writing to those people who want to read something. So. Well, when I first read that question, the first thing that occurred to me was that blue-collar comedy guy. I'm not sure what his name is.
Jeff Foxworthy.
Well, the one who's with him, the get her done. So that's what I was thinking about. Because really, that's what it is it's work. It's work I love to do, and people who write generally love it. But it's work, and you just keep writing, even when the muse is not there. And you keep writing even when people don't want to publish it, because it's really not about the publishing. It's that love affair with the page, and the process of writing is more important. It's a way of thinking and being that is important. And it's really great to get published, but it's not the only reason to do it. And to keep trying, to not stop just because one person doesn't like it. I have several projects that I'm working on. So I have a novel that I would very much like to have published, that I think is in a pretty close to being finished stage. And I have another collection of short stories. I'm putting it together. I have essays that I'm not quite sure if they will be a collection or what exactly they'll be, but I do have essays that I would like to put forth. It's a new short story, and every story has several sets of parents. So this one of the ways I taught at UNO last semester at the writer's workshop, and my policy as a teacher is I always write with my students. I never ask my students to do something that I'm not doing with them. And this particular story came out of an exercise in which I asked them to write about a childhood memory from a childhood point of view, and then we had to rewrite it and rework with it from an adult perspective and put it back and forth. So we manipulated this text for a while, and then they had the option of working with theirs however they wanted, and I took mine and kept working until it became the story.
Good evening. My name is Robin Thompson, and I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames reading series. The Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room is a special collection that's dedicated to preserving and promoting works by Nebraska authors. Currently, we maintain a collection of over 12,000 items by more than 3,000 Nebraska authors. You're more than welcome to come in during our regular public service hours to explore the room or just sit down and read one of the books from your favorite Nebraska authors. We need to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because we're only able to bring you special programs like this one through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts. And tonight, our reader is Karen Shoemaker. Award-winning author Karen Shoemaker grew up in O'Neill, Nebraska, which is in Holt County, as she likes to brag. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism in 1985, and she went on to receive both her master's and a PhD in creative writing from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. In 1985, Shoemaker won the Nebraska Press Association Award for feature writing, and she's received both the Mari Sandoz Award and the Vreeland Award for short fiction. And in 2001, one of her short stories was shortlisted for the Best American Short Stories Award. She's associated with a local writers group called Prairie Trout, and her volume of short stories, Night Sounds and Other Stories, was published in 2002 and won the Nebraska Book Award for short fiction. Please help me welcome Karen Shoemaker.
I'm so glad there are people who hoot here. That is so fun. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the library. And I didn't write down all the places I was supposed to thank, so I'm just going to say thank you, everybody. I'm going to read a short story tonight. It's a new story, which in writer talk means no publisher has rejected it yet. The story is Cain's sister, and it came out of I taught at UNO's Writers Workshop this past semester, and it came out of a writing assignment I gave my students. I don't make them do anything that I don't do myself, and I just kept working with it and came with this story. I hope you enjoy it. It's called Cain's Sister. The cat was an old calico with a notched ear, mismatched eyes, and a purr that rattled like she had something broken inside. We found her in a ditch, almost dead from hunger, late one morning on the front edge of summer, when nights it rained and the days bloomed yellow gold with promise. When first we came upon her, she was mewing and scrambling and trying like all heaven to get up out of a culvert, but not making much progress against the concrete sides. The two of us crouched down and looked at her for a little bit. She didn't look dangerous. Then my brother up and took his shirt off right there beside the highway, right in front of God and everybody, slid down into the culvert and draped it over that cat. He wrapped it around her until she was nothing but a faded denim work shirt bundle with a cat face that he cradled in his arms like she was some precious baby. When he got back up to the road beside me, he said to get her home we'd use the burlap bag, the one that held the pop bottles we'd been collecting. I couldn't believe he expected me to give up on my dream of riches and dump the bottles out, and I told him as much. I'm not giving up 25 cents worth of pop bottles for no cat. I talked tough, but I knew he'd win. Come on, Abby, you can have my share, he said, and I'll carry 3 of them, and you can carry the other 2. We don't need a bag for just 5. Well, glory be. I have to admit, I thought right then that cat was something special because I never, ever had won an argument with Cain so fast without the intervention of some higher power. I dumped the bottles out onto the gravel and spread the burlap out smooth as I could. Cain placed the cat bundle down in the middle of it, and we picked her up and carried her home in a bag-made sling between us. Funny thing how she didn't fight to get out of what Cain had wrapped her in. She just lay there, blinking at us when we got our faces up close enough to look at her. Her purr took us both by surprise when first she started in.
We thought there was a cicada caught up in the bundle or some such thing, and we stopped under a tree a couple blocks from home and put her down on the ground to get a better look and listen to her. We had no idea the rattle we heard inside that cat was pieces of the world getting ready to break. Let's name it Hot Rod, I said, after we'd satisfied ourselves there were no insects wrapped up with her. He sounds like one of those things the Beckwith boys drive. First of all, Cain said patiently, we know she's a she, not a he. And second of all, we got to get to know her better before we can know what her name is. Naming is serious business. How do we know she's a she? I asked. I didn't even know what to look for to learn that sort of information, and I liked it that Cain said we, even though it was only him that knew. She's a calico. All calicos are girls. That's just one of God's decisions, he said. He motioned for me to pick up my side of the sling, and we started toward home again. We'll just take our time, maybe whisper some names in her ear and see how she answers. It'll just take some time. My brother. Can you believe his name was Cain? And in a Christian family yet? Cain cooed to her all the way home, telling her everything was going to be okay. She was going to be all right now that we'd found her. When I told him we couldn't keep her, I whispered because I didn't want to be the one to break the news to her. She looked so peaceful between us. You just keep your mouth closed, Cain said, and this will work out fine. I looked down at the cat, which blinked back up at me, and I looked over at Cain's hand, the one holding the bag. My eyes followed his arm up to his shoulder, and I noted muscles I didn't even know he had, shifting and moving beneath his fair skin. I decided to believe him. When we got to our block, we cut through the alley behind Jansen's and Wilson's to get to the playhouse out in our backyard. Nobody ever goes out there but us. We made a bed for her in an old egg crate and then set out to get her fed. It was a beautiful thing how that worked out. Mom was standing in the kitchen when we walked in, and without even waiting for Cain to tell me what to do, I asked her about her garden. About what was that green lacy stuff coming up in the last row down by the street. She walked over the door to look at it while she answered, and Cain grabbed a cup of milk and slipped out the back door. I could hardly keep from laughing, it worked so well, and I almost ruined it by running out the back door to catch up with Cain, but I stopped my feet just in time so I didn't give it all away. We fed her through a straw until she was strong enough to eat on her own. Then Cain talked me into agreeing the money we got for turning in pop bottles could buy her food. That was the hardest part for me. I had plans for my wealth, and feeding a cat wasn't a part of them. I had enough trouble with my own temptations. For example, the Ben Franklin store down on Douglas Street had 2 doors along its glass front. A candy counter stood between those doors, so no matter which one you chose, you had to walk past it. It was a vision, that candy counter. Glass cases filled with colors and shapes to make your mouth water. Your intentions disappear. You could buy as little as could be measured into a silver scoop or as much as could fill it, though buying a full scoop was something I only dreamed about. Yellow and orange corn candy wedges, pink circles of mint lozenges, red and black licorice twists, maple nut goodies, oh, the crunchy, chewy sweetness that could so often trip me up, and all that before I even got to the chocolate stars. When I think of heaven, I imagine that it has 2 doors with a candy counter between them. And when you step through one, your pocket grows heavy with spendable coins. Same picture with temptation. If the devil wanted to turn my head around, he'd just have to set up a candy counter with glass cases over rows and rows of bars and gum and rolls of mints. I found it nigh on impossible to walk past such a work of art. What I'd really been saving my nickels for, though, was something farther back in the store. Near the back, between fabrics and toys, down the aisle from knickknacks, were the plastic animal statues. You could get most any farm animal you wanted, though why anybody would want a statue of a pig was beyond me. But horses, the horses. For Christmas the year before, I got a gray mare grazing, her white tail molded against her flank like she'd been frozen in the act of swatting a fly. She had white stockings, a white mane, and a white tail, and I thought she was just about as beautiful as a gray mare could be. With the quarters I found in my Christmas stocking and the $1 Grandma and Grandpa slipped me just before my birthday, I bought the white colt with the gray mane and tail that belonged to her. He had all 4 feet planted stiff-legged on the ground. His tail stood up impishly like they do when their tails are still more fluff than strands. He held his head cocked to the side and his ears at attention like any moment he was going to spring into action and race across my bookshelf, kicking and prancing. Just before school, they got a stallion in, and I knew the minute I saw him, I had to have him. He was black with not a speck of white on him, and he was standing on his hind legs. Braced by a flowing tail that held him upright, his 4 feet pawed at the air. He was an Arabian. I could tell by the shape of his head. The way his head and neck were thrown back, he could have been fighting a grizzly or a man with a rope, and you knew he would win. He was so beautiful he made me want to cry when I'd stop in to see him. I was so afraid one time I'd come in and he'd be gone. Someone else would have taken him home, and my horse family would never be complete. He cost $4.59. That's almost 100 pop bottles when you count in the tax. On a good day, me and Cain could only find about 10 bottles, and I had to split that with him. Now we had a hungry cat to feed. I came up with the idea of feeding her food from our own plates instead of buying something special. I tried to make it sound like it was all about the cat, about how it would be better for her if we gave her the kind of good food Mom gave us, but Cain saw through that easily enough. He knew about me visiting the black stallion. "It's okay," he said. "You give what you can." Did I mention how much I loved him then? This was the summer Cain grew hair on his upper lip and his eyebrows grew dark and heavy. The summer his voice slipped down toward manhood. Sometimes he seemed so exotic to me, like a movie star or someone I didn't know. I wanted to marry somebody just like him. We knew that as soon as Mom and Dad found out we had a cat in the playhouse, the cat was as good as gone. So we kept her to ourselves. We lined an egg crate with some of Cain's old shirts and got another crate to put sand in so she could do her business without leaving the shed. Cain got a pail of warm water and some rags out of the house without being caught, and we got her cleaned up. I always heard cats didn't like water, but that cat let us wash her up and flop her around like it was the best life she'd ever had. That purr of hers rattled loud as all get out every time we touched her. That notched-eared, rattle-trap cat was our biggest and best secret. It lasted little better than 3 hours. You can't look innocent when you've got secrets to hide, or at least we couldn't. I don't know who saw us first, sneaking in and out to the playhouse, and I don't know who told Mom, and I don't know who first said we were doing something no brother and sister ought ever to do. What I know is, all of a sudden, all hell broke loose, and hiding the cat wasn't anything we had to worry about anymore. Cain got it worse than I did. He's a boy and older than me and ought to know better, our Mom told him. She went wild in the telling. Hair come loose from the ponytail she always wore, kinky strings of it falling in her face. Her eyes so red from crying they looked like she'd rimmed them with a marker. She was cooking oatmeal for lunch when I came in through the back door, just back from visiting the cat. Mom stood at the stove stirring so furiously, water from the oatmeal slopped out of the pan. The burner flames sputtered and flared, making the kitchen feel like a dangerous place to be. I stayed at the door and twisted a strand of hair around my finger, rolling it tight enough to hurt, and just listened. Cain sat with his hands flat on the table. I couldn't tell if he was trying to hold himself or the table down. What Mom was saying didn't make any sense, and some of the words she was using sounded like the ones she never let anybody say in front of me. She was saying sin, and she was saying sex, and she was saying a whole bunch of stuff I couldn't make heads or tails of. She spits when she screams, and her words run together and get out of order. I flat out didn't know what to make of her or what she was saying. Cain tried to interrupt her, but she wouldn't let him. She just kept getting louder and louder until he finally slapped the table and stood up. Mom spun around toward him with the oatmeal-covered spoon out in front of her like a sword. Mom's not a tiny woman, but Cain loomed over her like she was a little kid. This was the summer he grew tall as a man, and that particular change seemed to happen all at once, in that very moment. His hands gripped the table, but it seemed as if he were reaching toward her, as if he were poised to strike. For a moment, the only thing moving was a big blob of oatmeal sliding slow motion down the spoon handle until it reached Mom's hand and splattered on the floor. Until that moment, the idea that Cain could hurt anybody was an idea that had never visited my head. Violence, I believed, lived in the domain of my mother, if it lived at our house at all. She was fierce in her way, as likely to smack one of us on the butt as to hug us unexpected. What scared me was not the sight of my mother wielding a spoon like a weapon. She'd done that before. What scared me was what I saw in Cain's face. It seemed to have fallen somehow, his smooth young face canyoned with something dark and cold. Maybe I made a noise. Maybe I took a deep breath or something that made them look away from each other and turn toward me. I looked into Cain's eyes, at my mother's face. I had the strangest sensation that they were both naked and reaching out for me, as if something within them had suddenly taken shape and now stood newly born between us. My intestines twisted, hot and liquid. I did not want to choose between them. I began to cry, unable to move. What saved us was not me or my tears. It was the untended oatmeal boiling over, lumpy strands of it bubbling over the sides of the pan into the flames. The stink of burning cereal filled the air, and we all turned toward the stove, horrified. When Cain reached around my mother and turned off the burner, she recoiled from him, as if his touch held the heat of the flames or something far worse. Some things are unforgivable. The kitchen popped and sizzled with silence until Cain went out the back door and let it slam behind him. I started to follow him, but I stopped and turned back to Mom. She stood at the sink running water into the pan of ruined cereal. "Mom," I said. She looked at me, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You," she said. "You." I waited for her to say more, for her to tell me what was going on. Why was everyone so angry, I wanted to know. She just stared at me, and then she told me to get out of her sight. The playhouse where we kept the cat was an old shed built by somebody who didn't know much about building anything. It had a dirt floor, one door, and 2 square holes in the wall for windows. A thick post smack in the middle of the room held up the roof. The post was bowed in the middle and leaned to the side, making it look like the shed weighed too much and was going to come down at any moment. A piece of plywood on rusty hinges served as a door. A stretch of wire wrapped through 2 holes in the wood made a handle. What daylight could get through, the lilac bushes along the side gave the only light, so you always had to stand still a minute when you first came in if you wanted to see anything before you ran into it. I stepped through the door and waited for my inside eyes. They had not yet adjusted to the dark when Cain stepped toward me. I knew he was there, and I knew it was him, and still I yelped, a pitiful sound. I flinched as I would before a stranger. As I said, some things are unforgivable. I could see well enough by then to see his face. It was wet. We stood for a moment facing each other before he brushed past me, taking care not to let even our shoulders touch in that small space. Once outside, he stopped and looked back at me over his shoulder, and I thought I could see that shape again, the form of something naked and reaching. The cat rubbed around my ankles, and I bent down to run my fingers along her tail. When I looked up again, Cain was gone. "Look what you done," I said to the cat. "Look what you done." When Dad got home, he wasn't any help. Sometimes he was. Sometimes he'd talk to Mom, and then he'd come talk to us, and then all the mad in the house would go back into hiding. Other times, he'd come home, and he'd get mad too, and he'd tell us why, and whether we agreed with him or not, we at least knew why. But not this time. This time, he came out of that back bedroom where he'd been talking to Mom, and he sat us down at the kitchen table and stared at us like we were piles of something the cat had started leaving in the sandbox. Cain hadn't talked to me since his fight with Mom, and he hadn't come out of that back bedroom all day. She hadn't come out of that back bedroom all day, so the house just crackled with quiet. Dad stared at us, and we stared at our feet. I think we sat there for 500 minutes before he said anything. "You know you're both going to hell, don't you?" I looked up at him, my mouth wanting to pop open. He had tears in his eyes, and he looked pale and old. He held his hands out in front of him as if in prayer. I looked at Cain. Cain looked at his feet. The awful quiet in that kitchen got heavy enough to see. Finally, I swallowed and whispered, "All we wanted to do was save her." My dad leaned over and looked at me with squinty eyes. "What did you say?" I looked over at Cain. He clenched his jaw so tight it looked like he had a jawbreaker in there, a big ball of something. I wanted him to talk. He told me if I kept my mouth shut, everything would be all right, but it wasn't working out that way. I knew nobody wanted us to have a cat, but I didn't think we'd go to hell if we found one and saved her life. I would have thought Cain could have mentioned that possibility to me. I don't want to go to hell, I whispered. Snot started coming out of my nose, and I wiped at it with the heel of my hand. I just wanted a cat. My dad sat back in his chair and looked down his nose at me. Then he looked at Cain. What is she talking about? Cain dipped his chin and didn't say anything. I said, my dad leaned close to Cain's face. What is she talking about? When Cain still didn't say anything, my dad looked at me. Abigail, what in the hell are you talking about? When my dad gets mad, he has a vein in his forehead that gets big and pulses like a wiggling snake. That night, the vein looked as big as I'd ever seen it, and I thought if I told him about the cat, the vein would explode. I wiped more snot away, but it was coming too fast now, and I could taste it salty on my lip. I licked it away. Nothing. My dad's face was so close to mine, I could see beads of sweat in the tiny holes on his nose. I was too scared to say anything. His blue eyes, so close to mine, looked like they had no bottom to the sadness in them. Did he promise you a cat? He asked quietly. That's when Cain exploded. He stood up so fast his chair fell over backwards. No, he yelled. I didn't promise her anything. I didn't do anything. We found a cat. We saved a cat. It's just a cat. Why didn't somebody ask me what we were doing out there? What's wrong with you people? For a moment, everything, even the dust motes in the light coming through the window, seemed frozen. Nobody breathed or moved. We must have looked like a picture, like sculptures, not like real people at all. It was Cain who broke the spell. Some kind of calm seemed to come over him. He picked up the overturned chair and walked out of the house. His straight back, when I watched it go, looked like a soldier's. My dad didn't try to stop him. He just sat there staring at the door Cain had let close behind him. Silence sizzled around us. After what seemed like forever, my dad made a noise in his throat. A gust of air came out his mouth, and he sagged in his seat. He looked like he was going to disappear completely. Hoping to catch him before he was gone, I whispered, "Why do I have to go to hell?" When I was little, long before this all happened, I thought things had to be solved. When something got broke, you fixed it. When something got lost, you found it. But that's not how things work. Things get broken or lost all the time. You go to bed, you get up, you live without whatever it was. The cat was gone by supper time. Mom said we could visit her over at Sutton's place. She said the cat would be better off there. She could catch the mice and come and go as she pleased, and nobody would worry about her getting into things she shouldn't, Mom said. She was sorting laundry like it was an emergency when she delivered this news. Cain sat at the table in Dad's place, and I hid around the corner in the hallway, just listening to neither of them saying anything for a long, stretched-out minute. Cain's newly thick eyebrows were knotted into one dark line. The shadow above his lips didn't hide the trembling. His Sun Games t-shirt had a hole on the left shoulder that looked as though he had worked it from almost there to almost ruin. His jeans were too short, and the knobs of his ankles stood out white against his tan. Both his shirt and jeans looked like they hadn't been through the wash in a month of Sundays. He looked too much like somebody nobody cared about, and it made my throat tight to look at him. "You gave her to old Man Sutton?" Cain asked in a quiet voice. "That's right, I did," Mom said. She scooped one load of clothes up off the floor and dumped it into the washing machine. She poured a cupful of detergent on top of it and then turned on the water. Even I knew she had things out of order, but I didn't say anything. I just watched. "He's got dogs," Cain said in that same quiet voice. Old Man Sutton lived down the block from us in a little gray stuccoed house set back from the street and mostly hidden behind untrimmed bushes and a big wooden fence. It's not happened since I've been around, but some kids say he shoots anybody who tries to come into his yard. I don't think that's true. I think people just picked that idea up from a TV show they watched, but I didn't know. Mom nodded vigorously, her ponytail bobbing. Yes, he does. I know that. He has a goat, too, as I understand it. And cats. He's got cats, too. He's got himself a regular zoo over there, and now he has one more cat. We have no use for a cat around here. You want to spend your money or your time on something, you get out to that garden and do some work. You think it's easy growing food for this family? You think all this stuff we eat just pops up out of the ground? She should have stopped and let it go at that. But she kept talking until even I couldn't stand the sound of her voice. She didn't have to make it sound like saving a cat was something stupid to do. She didn't have to say her garden was more important than any stupid cat. Why didn't she know she could say something different? Why didn't she say she was sorry about anything? As far as I knew, she never once told Cain she was sorry. She never once told Cain or me we weren't going to hell, that maybe they were wrong about that. Cain didn't wait for her to get to a stopping place. He got up and left while she was still in the middle of a sentence. I guess he could already see which way the wind was blowing, and nothing good was coming his way. He got up and left, and before I could get to the door to follow him, he was gone. I hollered for him, but he must not have heard me. I went back inside, and Mom was still talking, not even noticing she didn't have an audience. I sidled into my bedroom, trying to be invisible, and got my horse statues off the shelf. Out at the edge of the garden, I patted a smooth area in the dirt for meadows and kicked my heel into the soft, sandy soil to make canyons alongside them. I pulled handfuls of grass out of the yard and covered the meadow area with green. I set the mare and the colt in the middle of it and then started pulling dirt up into a ridge for a mountain range. It was hard work, and I had a sweat on, but try as I might, all I could see was garden soil and plastic horses. I don't think even that stallion from down at Ben Franklin's could have saved me. I took the horses back inside and went out to the front porch, where I sat down to wait and look for something else to do. A couple of ants were pushing miniature boulders up out of a crack in the sidewalk. I leaned down and blew hard on some sand in their direction. That's not as bad as pushing it back down in the crack, but even so. I wondered what hell would feel like. A robin hopped across the sidewalk in front of me from one straggle of green to another. I curled my bare toes around the chipped edge of the top step. I felt loose, and without even checking to see if anyone was watching, I took aim at a daisy head. Kicking heads off daisies was something we weren't supposed to do, and I was better at it than anybody. Most people can catch a blossom between the big toe and the second one and snap the head off of a daisy if they want to, but they run the risk of grabbing too much daisy. You can pull a whole plant up out of that sandy soil before you even had the chance to realize the roots had come free. Try to explain that to my mother. Even though daisies grew up wild wherever they wanted to, my mom never considered them weeds. She insisted we treat them like any other garden flower. Like a gift, damn it. You think it's easy growing anything on a wish and a prayer? As far as I was concerned, they were only good for exactly what I was doing, kicking their heads off, by catching them between the tips of my second and third toes. Mom would have a fit if she caught me doing this, but I didn't care. I felt reckless and almost lightheaded as I sent more and more daisy heads out across the lawn. Most of their little white and yellow faces landed upside down with their stems upright. They looked like something like skinny, headless women wearing big white skirts. I tried to imagine what sort of dance they could do when all of a sudden the screen door slapped open behind me, and I thought sure I was good and caught. It was Cain. He didn't pay any attention to me or the daisies. He sat down on the porch swing and kicked off so hard he hit the back wall. I squinted at him, hoping that would make him stop because we got in big trouble when we swung too high in that swing. But he kicked off again, and this time left a mark on the stucco behind him. I'm telling, I said, at the exact time he said the same words in that high-pitched voice he used when he wanted to make fun of me. We just looked at each other then. I think we were both surprised to discover we sounded so much like ourselves. Somehow you'd think some changes would show. Anyway, Cain stopped the swing from hitting the wall and turned his face away from me. A shaft of sunlight came through the trees right then and caught him full on, but it didn't light him up. He looked as though he could swallow up the whole of the sun in his dark eyes and not even shed a spark. The cat. Cain's voice went all squeaky and high when he spoke, like air squeezing out of a pinched-off balloon, and he couldn't get any more words out. I didn't want to hear them anyway. I'd had enough of that cat. I found out that when I'd run my finger along that notch in her ear, she'd put her paw on my hand to hold it down and stop me. I figured if a cat could decide things, so could I. If every time you thought about something, say something like elephants, if every time you thought about an elephant, you got a hard pinch that locked up your throat so you couldn't breathe, wouldn't you do your best to not think about elephants? If you were me, you would. You'd just take the word elephant right out of the list of words you know. Cats were my elephants now, especially a cat with a notched ear and mismatched eyes and a rattled purr. Too many pictures started coming into my head when he said cat, and each one of them took a bit of air out of my lungs and made me feel like I was inside something burning. This is what hell feels like, I thought, and I didn't want to go to hell. No, I said. What I meant was, no, don't tell me. No, I don't want to know. To emphasize my point, I took flight. Off the porch, over the heads of daisies, and I was gone. I hit my stride before I hit the green of yard, and at the gravel drive I was running full out, long hair fanned out behind me like a wild horse's mane, my bare feet pounding hard as hooves on the powdery soil. I rounded the garden and kept going until my heart beat in my throat and I couldn't get any air. I liked to think I could go on forever if I wanted to, but my legs gave out and my toe caught sod, and I was face down on the ground, not near far enough away from what I was running from. Cain was beside me before I even caught my breath. He dropped to the ground beside me, and when I opened my eyes, his face was so close to mine I could have touched it. His eyes, swirling charcoal, rimmed in black, held me where I lay as firmly as hands. How can I ever say what passed between us then? All I know is that before he spoke, I knew he was going to ask me to do something I didn't want to do, that we weren't supposed to do, and I knew I would do it, whatever it was. He cleared his throat and closed his eyes. On his right temple, he had a tiny scar from when he fell on a nail when he was little, before I was born. It looks like a small crescent moon. It fluttered now over his wild pulse. 2 of Sutton's dogs got the cat. His voice came out in that same pinched-off squeak. Without thinking, I reached out and put my hand over the hole in his shirt like I was trying to hold something in. I saw it happen, he said. Then he swallowed hard and took a deep breath, sending the words out in one rush. I couldn't get across the fence in time. I had to run down the alley and around to the front. By the time I got there, old man Sutton had got the cat free from the dogs, and he tossed her up on the roof of his woodshed. I said I wanted her back. I told him I wanted to help her, but he said she was dead, and I was to stay the hell out of his yard or he'd sick the dogs on me, too. He called Mom and told her that, too. I rolled onto my back and sat up before I answered. What'd Mom say? He snorted and sat up, too. You know what she said. And I did. I didn't need to have him repeat it. So what are we going to do? I don't know, Cain answered. We got up without a plan and started walking toward the road. The sun had disappeared over the horizon to the west, and a squirrel chittered from a nearby tree. Other than that, we seemed all alone in the universe. Cars didn't come down this road unless drivers were headed for someplace on it, so not much traffic came through on any given day. All the trucks must have left town for the day, too, because you couldn't even hear the hum of the highway. It was just me and Cain. We didn't go straight to Sutton's. We cut around back to the alley and come up on his place from the back. I let Cain lead because I knew he was going to show me something I didn't necessarily want to see. I started thinking about what a cat would look like after 2 dogs had been after it. I started thinking about what holds a cat together and what happens when whatever that is gets ripped apart. I fixed my eyes on the hole in Cain's shirt, the one he had worked from tiny to too big to cover his shoulder. I looked at the white knob of shoulder bone that showed through that hole. I started thinking about what's inside a cat, about the coils I had seen strung out beside something that's been killed alongside the road, about the smear of blood and something thicker that draws crows out of the sky and makes them brave even when a car is coming at them full tilt. Cain, I said. I reached out to grab his hand. I don't think I want to see this. He turned back to me, and I thought for a moment he was going to stop. but he just said, "Come on." He pointed to the place in the fence where a board had been broken loose, and you could see into that yard, where going into it meant getting dogs sicked on you, or worse. "Cain," I said again, but he pulled me toward the gap. "I need you to get those dogs over here and keep them here. You understand?" No, I thought. I don't understand anything. "Yes," I whispered. "I'm going to go around front and go through the gate and get the cat. I'll come back for you here." The alley was dark with shadows, even though the west still glowed like daylight. I looked around at all the places things could hide, and I tried to tell myself not to be scared. "What if old Man Sutton shoots you?" I called out to him in a loud whisper. "Then I'll be dead," Cain said over his shoulder. "You wait here until I get back." This is not right, I thought, but I wasn't sure. I picked up a stick that looked big enough to get the dog's attention and fight off any monsters, and I wound up and hit the fence as hard as I could. The tin cans Sutton had nailed to the top rang out, and the dogs came running, barking and growling like the end of the world. They hit the fence like linebackers. They were too big to get any more than their wet black noses through the gap, so I figured I was in charge of the situation now. I couldn't see the front gate to check on Cain, but I was pretty sure anybody inside that house would be looking back here anyway. Those dogs were making one heck of a ruckus. I hit the fence one more time for good measure, then I grabbed a handful of foxtail from the fence line and started tickling the dogs' noses. They didn't like that any better than me hitting the fence. I could keep them all here all night if I wanted to. I heard Cain running before I saw him. "Come on," he said, and grabbed my arm. "Somebody's coming." I took off running after him, Cain almost dragging me to help me keep up. The alley behind Sutton's place ran between lilacs and scrub trees. Some of the neighbors had fences buried inside their portions of the hedge, where you couldn't see the fence for the trees, and others had paths right down the middle of them. You had to know which was which, because you couldn't tell by looking at them, and if you weren't careful, you could get yourself cornered. Sometimes I did, when Cain and I were playing hide and seek out this way, but Cain never did. He could weave in and out of every yard in the neighborhood without stumbling against a fence or a clothesline or a stack of old tires. Whoever it was that was coming after us didn't stand a chance of catching us once Cain pulled me into the first hedge, and we didn't go very far before we stopped to listen for whatever was behind us. At first, all I could hear was our breathing, fast and furious. Even Sutton's dog had settled down. I couldn't see anything. I started to shift my weight around, but Cain put his hand on my shoulder and pressed me into place. The weight of his hand held me still for what seemed like hours. When he decided we could move, we did, slowly, crouched down to make our way through the paths in the hedge, following it all the way back to our own yard. From the edge of the lilacs, you could see straight into our kitchen window. It wasn't until we saw Mom standing at the sink alone in the room and nowhere near the phone that we felt safe. No one following us, and no one sneaking on ahead to report to her first. We crouched at the edge of the bushes beside the playhouse, letting our breath come back to normal. I saw Cain didn't have a shirt on, and then I saw the bundle in his arms. He held her like a baby, just like he did when he brought her up out of the ditch. "We don't even know her name," he whispered. His face was in shadow, too dark for me to see, but I know what crying sounds like. Over his left shoulder, a scar-shaped moon tipped the treetops. Its eerie light changed the look of everything. Even the playhouse appeared strange to me. I looked around for something familiar. It felt as if our run through the hedges had delivered us to some foreign country, not at all the one I'd woke up in just that morning. I knew before I even stepped back out into the light that in this new country, the rules were all changed. What I understood about the world would no longer help me, and it was both immensely larger and so much smaller than I ever could have imagined. In this new country, things came and went without reason. Things died. After a minute, Cain said, "Come on, we'll bury her in the playhouse." He took my hand to help me stand up, and together, using a garden trowel and a tin can, we dug a hole in the corner. When it was deep enough, we picked up the limp body of the cat and wrapped her in the clothes we had been wearing. When our parents called for us, we did not answer.